DHEWARTH killed 30 million POT, A and N nobody ATA, A boot IT, and nobody ATA U A boot IT, U A boot IT. Date spoken naturally. World War I killed around 20 million people. It is one of the most studied, documented, and memorialized conflicts in human history. Every major Western school teaches it. There are museums, movies, novels, national holidays, entire fields of academic study dedicated to its causes and consequences. 20 million dead. Have you ever heard of the Taiping Rebellion? It happened in China between 1850 and 1864. It killed 30 million people. Some historians put the number at 70 million. You probably haven't heard of it. And the fact that you haven't, that is the most important part of this story. To understand why 30 million people died, you first need to understand the China they lived in. In 1850, China was the most populous nation on Earth, home to roughly 400 million people ruled by the Qing Dynasty, which had governed the country since 1644. The Qing were Manchu, a people from the northeast, not Han Chinese. To many of the Han population, who made up the vast majority of the country, this mattered. The ruling dynasty was foreign. They had conquered China. They maintained their power through force and through a rigid system of loyalty and examination. For over 2 centuries, this system had held, but by 1850, it was cracking. The crack had a name: the Opium Wars. Britain had discovered that it could balance its trade deficit with China by selling opium, grown in British India, smuggled into Chinese ports. When China's government tried to stop the trade, Britain went to war. The First Opium War ended in 1842. China lost, humiliatingly, completely. The Qing Dynasty, which had presented itself as the center of the civilized world, was forced to open its ports, pay massive indemnities, and cede Hong Kong to the British Empire. For the Chinese, this was not just a military defeat. It was a shattering of the entire worldview that said China was supreme, that the emperor ruled under heaven's mandate, that the Qing were legitimate. The emperor had been revealed as vulnerable. The dynasty had been exposed as weak. The military defeat was visible and humiliating. But underneath it, the social pressure had been building for decades. China's population had doubled in the century before 1850. The land hadn't grown. The jobs hadn't multiplied. Millions of people in southern China, particularly in Guangdong province, were competing for fewer and fewer resources. The Hakka people, an ethnic subgroup within the Han Chinese, faced particular discrimination. They had migrated to the region and were frequently in violent conflict with local communities over land, water, and survival. And then there was the examination system. In imperial China, the civil service exam was the only legitimate path to power, status, and security. Families spent generations preparing their sons to take it, and generation after generation, the vast majority failed, leaving brilliant, educated, ambitious men with nowhere to go and no future in sight. By the late 1840s, southern China was a region full of desperate people. Opium addiction was spreading, deliberately encouraged by British trade, now flowing freely through the treaty ports. Unemployment was rampant. Ethnic violence between Hakka and local communities was intensifying. The Yellow River had flooded, displacing millions. Famine was spreading. The Qing response was, collect taxes, maintain order, preserve the dynasty. There was no social safety net, no path for the desperate, no legitimate channel for grievance. The government that was supposed to protect these people was instead demanding tribute from them. In these conditions, any message that offered an alternative, a new identity, a new God, a new order, a new China, would find listeners. It only needed someone to deliver it. His name was Hong Xiuquan. He was born in 1814 into a poor Hakka farming family in Guangdong province. He was exceptionally bright. His family recognized it early and sacrificed to give him an education. He studied Confucian classics for years. He memorized the texts. He prepared. He was going to take the imperial exam and rise. He took the exam in the provincial capital of Guangzhou. He failed. He studied more. He went back. He failed again. He went back a third time in 1837. He failed again. In imperial China, this was not a minor setback. This was the destruction of everything he had worked toward, everything his family had sacrificed for, every future he had imagined for himself. The system had told him 3 times, "You do not belong here." After his 3rd failure, Hong Xiuquan collapsed. He returned home and fell into what we would now recognize as a severe mental breakdown. For weeks, he burned with fever. He experienced vivid, intense visions. He saw an old man with a golden beard who gave him a sword and commanded him to slay demons. He saw a younger man who called himself elder brother and taught him how to fight. When Hong recovered, he could not fully explain what he had experienced. He filed the visions away. He tried to move on. He kept teaching in a village school. He took the exam a 4th time and failed again. He was a man with nowhere to go and nothing to hope for. And then, years later, everything changed. Years before his breakdown, in Guangzhou, a man had pressed a pamphlet into Hong's hands. It was a Christian missionary text, a collection of Bible passages and explanations written by a Chinese convert named Liang Afa. Hong had read it briefly and set it aside. He kept it. After his 4th exam failure, around 1843, he picked it up again. He read it with different eyes now. The old man with the golden beard. God the Father. The elder brother who had taught him to fight demons. Jesus Christ. And if God was the Father and Jesus was the elder brother, then Hong Xiuquan, who had received these visions directly from them, was the younger son of God, the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Chosen, sent, commissioned, not a failed student, the Son of God. Hong Xiuquan began to preach. He baptized himself. He baptized his cousin and his closest friend. He destroyed the Confucian tablets in the school where he taught, an act of astonishing boldness that cost him his position. He and his companions traveled through the mountainous regions of Guangxi province, preaching to the most desperate communities in China. Poor Hakka farmers, unemployed miners, women with no social protection, people who had been told by every institution they existed within that they had no future. His message was simple and explosive. The Qing Dynasty was demonic. The Confucian order was false. God, his God, offered a new kingdom, a new equality, a new identity. The desperate heard him. By the late 1840s, his God Worshippers Society had thousands of members. On January 11th, 1851, his 37th birthday, Hong Xiuquan made it official. He proclaimed the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. He declared himself the heavenly king. He announced that God had sent him to overthrow the Qing Dynasty and establish a new order on earth. His followers knelt before him. Tens of thousands of them. Men and women who had been farmers and miners and outcasts, now soldiers of God, now subjects of the heavenly kingdom, now part of something that gave their desperate lives meaning and direction. The Qing government, receiving reports of this new movement in Guangxi, did not take it seriously at first. They would soon discover their mistake. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in the 19th century. The Taiping Army, poorly armed, barely trained, but burning with religious conviction, began to move north. They swept through Guangxi. They took Yong'an. They marched into Hunan. They advanced on the Yangtze River. And in March 1853, they captured Nanjing. Nanjing was the 2nd city of China, a city of millions, ancient capital of dynasties, home of magnificent monuments and vast populations. The Taiping took it in days. Hong Xiuquan entered the city in a great procession and renamed it Tianjing, the heavenly capital. He took up residence in a palace. The heavenly kingdom now had its throne. What the Taiping built in the territory they controlled was unlike anything China had seen. Foot binding, the practice of breaking and binding girls' feet that had been enforced for centuries, was banned immediately and completely. Women who had bound feet were freed from the practice. Women could serve in the military. Women could hold official positions. In the 1850s, this was radical beyond description. The Taiping proposed communal land ownership. Land would be redistributed based on the number of people in each family, not inherited by the wealthy. Surplus would be shared. Opium was absolutely forbidden, punishable by death. So was alcohol. So was tobacco. So was gambling. So was prostitution. Every person in Taiping territory was required to study the scriptures of the heavenly kingdom. Literacy was to be universal. But the Taiping heavenly kingdom was also a theocratic state of extreme religious severity. Buddhist temples were destroyed. Confucian shrines were burned. The classical texts that had defined Chinese civilization for 2,000 years were banned as demonic. Any worship of anything other than Hong Xiuquan's god was forbidden. The 10 Commandments were enforced with lethal severity. Adultery was punishable by death. Disrespect for the Sabbath was punishable by death. Violations of the strict separation of men and women, even between married couples who were required to live in separate gender-segregated barracks, was punishable by death. The Taiping had come to liberate China. They had also come to control every aspect of its spiritual and moral life. And then there were the contradictions. Hong Xiuquan preached strict morality. He enforced the separation of men and women as a divine commandment. He threatened death for adultery. He himself kept a harem of dozens of concubines in his palace in Nanjing. He preached equality. He became increasingly reclusive, waited upon by servants, carried in a sedan chair, surrounded by luxury while his followers lived in the austere conditions he demanded of them. He was supposed to be the younger son of God, sent to save China. By the late 1850s, he rarely left his palace. He spent his days in religious meditation, and with his concubines, issuing proclamations his inner circle often had to interpret or quietly rewrite. The man who had started the movement from an exam failure and divine visions had become, in his heavenly palace, something uncomfortably close to what he claimed to have come to destroy. At its peak, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was a state of staggering scale. It controlled a territory comparable in size to France. It governed a population of over 30 million people. Its armies numbered over 1 million soldiers. It had its own currency, its own calendar, its own bureaucracy, its own religious texts, its own conception of what China should be. For over a decade, it controlled the Yangtze River Valley, the economic heart of China. The Qing Dynasty could not dislodge it. Two visions of China existed simultaneously, the old Confucian empire of the Qing and the new heavenly kingdom of the god worshippers. And between them, in the provinces that sat on the boundary between these two Chinas, the killing was continuous and vast. When word of the Taiping movement reached the Western world, the initial reaction from many missionaries and Christian observers was one of excitement. A Christian movement in China? A mass uprising against the Confucian order, led by a man who claimed to be the Son of God? Surely this was the beginning of the great Christian conversion of the most populous nation on earth. Western missionaries traveled to Nanjing to meet Hong Xiuquan. What they found confused them. The Taiping Christianity was unlike any Christianity they recognized. The Holy Trinity now included a fourth member. The religious texts were Hong's own visions and proclamations. Women were almost equal. The rituals were unfamiliar. This was not the Christianity the missionaries had in mind. They retreated, troubled and uncertain, to write their reports. The Western powers might have remained merely observers. But the Taiping made a decision that forced the issue. They advanced on Shanghai. Shanghai was the crown jewel of Western commercial presence in China, a treaty port opened by the Opium War, home to thousands of European and American merchants and missionaries, the center of the trade that the Western powers had gone to war to protect. The Taiping threatened it. Twice they advanced and were repulsed. But the threat was enough. In that moment, the Western calculation changed entirely. The Qing Dynasty, weak, humiliated, forced to grant treaty privileges, was the devil they knew. A strong, independent Taiping state that controlled the Yangtze Valley and might close the treaty ports was far more dangerous to Western commercial interests. The missionaries' theological reservations were convenient cover for what was, at bottom, a commercial decision. In 1860, a small but consequential military force was created to defend Shanghai and assist the king. It was called the Ever-Victorious Army. It was composed of Chinese soldiers, but officered by Westerners, armed with Western weapons and trained in Western tactics. Its first commander was Frederick Townsend Ward, a young American from Salem, Massachusetts, who had spent years as a mercenary across the globe and had arrived in Shanghai looking for adventure. Ward was 29 years old, audacious, reckless, and brilliant at irregular warfare. He built the ever-victorious army from scratch, trained it relentlessly, led it from the front. He was killed in battle in September 1862. He was 30 years old. His Chinese wife buried him with honors. Ward's replacement was a 30-year-old British officer named Charles George Gordon. Gordon was already an experienced soldier. He would go on to become one of the most famous military figures of the Victorian era. Later known as Gordon of Khartoum, dying heroically in Sudan in 1885, becoming a British national legend. But in 1862, he was simply a competent officer given command of a small but effective army in China. Gordon led the ever-victorious army with skill and discipline. He carried a rattan cane instead of a weapon. The magic wand, his soldiers called it. He was personally brave to the point of recklessness. Under his command, the ever-victorious army worked in coordination with Qing forces and the Jiang army to cut off Taiping supply lines and begin the final phase of the war. The irony is almost too perfect. Christian nations, Britain, the United States, whose soldiers were fighting in a war inspired by a man who believed himself the Son of God, chose to side with the Confucian Empire against the Christian kingdom. Not because of theology, because of trade, because Shanghai mattered, because the treaty ports needed to stay open, because Western merchants needed stable, weak, pliable Chinese rulers, not strong, independent, religiously motivated ones. The ever-victorious army helped end the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Gordon returned to Britain a celebrated hero. He never seemed troubled by what he had done in China. The 30 million people who died in the war he helped end were not in the newspapers he was celebrated in. To understand the death toll, you have to understand the geography of the war. The Taiping Rebellion was not fought in one place. It was a continent-sized conflict that rolled across southern and central China for 14 years. The Yangtze River Valley, one of the most densely populated regions on Earth, was the main theater. The provinces of Jiangxi, Anhui, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Hunan were all engulfed. These were not remote or sparsely populated territories. These were the agricultural and economic heartland of China, home to tens of millions of people. Every major city in this region was besieged, captured, recaptured, besieged again. Every siege meant the same thing: starvation, bombardment, slaughter. Every city that changed hands left tens of thousands dead. The man who ultimately crushed the Taiping was not a warrior. He was a scholar. Zheng Guofan was a Confucian bureaucrat from Hunan province. Deeply conservative, deeply learned, a man of the old order who understood that the old order was fighting for its life. When the Qing imperial army proved unable to contain the Taiping, Zheng was authorized to build his own force. He created the Jiang army, a regional fighting force bound by personal loyalty, Confucian discipline, and regional identity rather than imperial command structures. It was a different kind of army. It fought differently. It was motivated by something the Qing military had lost: genuine belief in what it was defending. Zheng Guofan is one of the most important figures in Chinese history. Almost no one in the West has heard of him. By 1862, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was encircled. Nanjing, the heavenly capital, was surrounded by Qing forces under Zheng Guofan's brother, Zheng Guoquan. The siege was methodical and total. Supply lines were cut. Relief forces were defeated one by one. Inside Nanjing, the population was starving. Hong Xiuquan refused to flee. He refused to negotiate. He issued proclamations telling the city's defenders that God would protect them. When his advisors told him the city was out of food, he told them to eat sweet dew. By this, he apparently meant the weeds and grass growing in the city's parks and gardens. He was, by this point, not fully in contact with the world outside his palace. Hong Xiuquan died in June 1864. He was 49 years old. The exact cause of his death is disputed. His court said he ascended to heaven. Chinese historians have suggested illness, possibly from eating poisonous plants during the famine. Others have suggested suicide. We will never know for certain. His teenage son briefly succeeded him as heavenly king. The boy was 15 years old and utterly unprepared. He was smuggled out of the city as the siege tightened. He was captured within weeks and executed by the Qing. The heavenly kingdom had no head, but the soldiers kept fighting anyway, because surrender meant death. Qing forces had made their intentions clear. There would be no mercy for the Taiping faithful. Nanjing fell on July 19, 1864. The Qing forces entered the city and found, depending on the account, tens of thousands of Taiping soldiers who chose to die rather than surrender. They set fire to their positions. They fought to the last. The slaughter that followed the city's fall was immense. Zheng Guoquan's forces were not known for mercy. The city that had been the heavenly capital was sacked. Zheng Guofan wrote to the emperor, "Not one of the rebels surrendered." He seemed to regard this as evidence of how deep the Taiping conviction had run. He was right. People who genuinely believe they are soldiers of God do not surrender easily. The Taiping Rebellion was not entirely over. Scattered remnants fought on for years, but the heavenly kingdom was finished. The dream, if it had ever been a dream and not a nightmare, was over. 30 million. Let us stay with that number for a moment. 30 million is larger than the population of Australia today. It is larger than the population of Texas. It is the entire population of Canada. 30 million people dead in one country in 14 years. And that is the conservative estimate. Some historians, using census data from before and after the rebellion, have calculated the excess deaths, including famine and disease in the war's aftermath, at 50, 60, even 70 million. The uncertainty itself tells you something. When the dead number in the tens of millions and we can't agree on exactly how many, it means the killing was so vast and so chaotic that no one could count it then, and no one can reconstruct it now. The regional impact was not evenly distributed. Some provinces were not just damaged, they were effectively depopulated. Anhui Province, which sat directly in the path of the war's most intense campaigns, may have lost half its population. Jiangsu, home of Nanjing, the commercial cities of Suzhou and Yangzhou, saw similar devastation. Suzhou, one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in China, described by Marco Polo as one of the great cities of the world, was nearly emptied. When travelers passed through in the late 1860s, they described vast areas of what had been a thriving metropolis now overgrown with weeds, the houses empty, the streets silent. Cities that had been home to hundreds of thousands were ghost towns. The scale of destruction was not just military, it was civilizational. Now let us do the comparison that belongs in every history textbook in the world. World War I, approximately 17 to 20 million dead, taught in every Western school, commemorated every November 11th, dozens of museums, hundreds of films, thousands of novels. The Holocaust, 6 million dead, one of the most documented atrocities in human history, taught in schools, memorialized globally. Never forget is a phrase that has entered every language. The Taiping Rebellion, 30 million dead. Minimum. How many films? How many museums in the Western world? How many November 11th equivalents? You know the answer. You are sitting with it right now. And the question of why. The question of whose deaths we memorialize and whose we file away as a statistic. That is not a comfortable question. But it is an important one. The killing didn't stop when the war ended. Wars of this scale leave ecological and social devastation that kills for years afterward. Agricultural land had been abandoned across the Yangtze Valley. Irrigation systems had been destroyed. The farming infrastructure that fed hundreds of millions of people had been shattered. Famines followed the war's end across the affected provinces. Disease moved through populations already weakened by years of siege and displacement. Communities that had lost half their adults had no one left to plant crops, no one to rebuild irrigation, no one to restore the social fabric that kept people alive. The 30 million who died in the war itself were followed by millions more. The war's death toll was the beginning of the reckoning, not the end of it. The Qing Dynasty survived the Taiping Rebellion, but it was not the same dynasty. The war had shattered the imperial military. The central Qing forces had proven useless against the Taiping. It was regional armies like Zheng Guofan's Jiang army that had won. Power had shifted from the imperial center to regional strongmen. The emperor now owed his throne to men he could not easily control. The treasury was empty. The Yangtze Valley economy was destroyed. Millions of soldiers from various armies were demobilized with no jobs and no prospects. The Qing dynasty would struggle on for another 50 years, but the Taiping Rebellion had broken something fundamental in its authority and its capacity. In 1912, it fell. The century of chaos that followed, warlordism, Japanese invasion, civil war, Mao, had roots that ran directly back to the generation that fought the Taiping. So why don't you know about this? The most straightforward answer is the one nobody wants to say directly. Western history education is profoundly Eurocentric. The lives and deaths that have been counted, memorialized, and taught as central to world history have predominantly been European and North American lives. When 20 million Europeans die in World War I, it is the defining catastrophe of the modern age. When 30 million Chinese die in the Taiping Rebellion, at roughly the same historical moment, It is a footnote. This is not a conspiracy. It is not deliberate malice. It is a structural bias so deep and so old that most people who perpetuate it have never examined it. The deaths that matter in history curricula are, with exceptions, the deaths of people who look like the people writing the curricula. The Qing Dynasty itself played a role in suppressing the memory. The Taiping Rebellion was, by any measure, a catastrophic failure of the Qing state. 400 million people under their rule, and they could not stop a movement of religious farmers from nearly destroying the dynasty. The Qing survived only with regional armies and Western military assistance. This was not a story the Qing wanted told. Official histories minimized the scale of the rebellion. The death toll was not systematically counted. The destruction was documented only by regional records, and many of those records had been destroyed in the war itself. Even in China, the full reckoning with the Taiping Rebellion's scale came slowly and incompletely. The Taiping Rebellion also resists easy categorization, and history tends to remember what it can categorize. Is it a religious war? Yes. It began with a man's divine visions and was fought in God's name. Is it a class war? Yes. It drew its strength from the poorest and most marginalized people in China. Is it a proto-feminist movement? In some ways, yes. It banned foot binding and gave women military roles. Is it a cult? Many historians would say yes. A charismatic leader who claimed divine authority demanded total obedience and kept a harem while preaching chastity. Is it a forerunner of Chinese communism? Mao Zedong thought so. He praised Hong Xiuquan as an early revolutionary. It is all of these things simultaneously, and history prefers its subjects to be one thing at a time. In the Western press of the 1850s and 60s, the Taiping Rebellion was covered, but it competed for attention with events that felt more immediately relevant to Western readers. The Crimean War was being fought. The American Civil War began in 1861. Italian unification was underway. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The transatlantic telegraph cable was laid. The American West was being settled. China was distant. The people dying were Chinese. The names were unfamiliar. The geography was vast and unmapped in Western minds. The journalists and editors who decided what mattered to Western readers made a calculation, conscious or unconscious, that the Taiping Rebellion was not, fundamentally, their story. In China, however, the memory never entirely disappeared. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, who overthrew the Qing in 1912, explicitly cited the Taiping as an inspiration. He saw Hong Xiuquan as a revolutionary who had tried and failed to remake China and whose failure pointed the way to what needed to be done. Mao Zedong praised the Taiping as an early manifestation of the revolutionary spirit that would eventually produce the Communist Party. Today, the Taiping Rebellion is taught in Chinese schools. There is a museum in Nanjing. There is historical scholarship. The Chinese memory of this event is complex and contested, but it exists. The erasure is overwhelmingly a Western phenomenon. The Taiping Rebellion is not a forgotten war. It is a war that was never learned, because the people who made the curricula decided, quietly and without much deliberation, that it did not need to be. What does Hong Xiuquan's story tell us? He was not a fool. He was not obviously insane. He was one of the most intelligent people in his region, in a society that had a rigorous and demanding system for identifying intelligence. He passed early examinations. He memorized vast quantities of classical text. He was a man of genuine gifts who lived in a system that offered him no legitimate path. Every door he tried was locked. The examination system, designed to find talent, failed him repeatedly and offered no alternative. In that context, the visions make a different kind of sense, not as evidence of madness, but as evidence of a mind that could not accept the verdict the world was giving it, that reached for something beyond the system that had rejected it. The desperate need for meaning is not a pathology. The Taiping Rebellion was what happened when that need collided with a social system with no capacity to absorb it. Religious conviction built the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and religious conviction destroyed it. The same absolute certainty that drove 1 million soldiers across China, that made them fight without adequate weapons, without adequate food, against vastly superior forces for over a decade, also made the Taiping incapable of compromise, incapable of reform, incapable of the political flexibility that might have allowed them to survive. You cannot negotiate with people who believe they are soldiers of God. But you also cannot rule a territory the size of France if you cannot negotiate with anyone. The Taiping's certainty was their greatest strength in war. It was their greatest weakness in governance. And Hong Xiuquan himself, the man at the center, had retreated so far into his own conviction that by the end he was eating weeds and telling his starving followers that God would provide. The certainty had become a closed room. The history we are not taught shapes the world we cannot understand. China today is the second largest economy on Earth, a nuclear power, a civilization of 1.4 billion people navigating a complex relationship with its own history and with the Western world. If you want to understand China, its sensitivity to foreign interference, its deep institutional memory of humiliation, its particular combination of revolutionary politics and conservative social control, you cannot understand it without the 19th century, without the Opium Wars, without the Taiping Rebellion, without the century of chaos that followed them. Western education has left most of its students completely unequipped to understand the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century. That is not an accident, but it is a problem. The Taiping Rebellion raises a question that history keeps asking and we keep refusing to answer. Whose wars do we count? We count the ones where the dead look like us, speak languages we recognize, died in places we have on our mental maps. We build museums and national holidays and moments of silence for those dead, the others. The 30 million who died in the Yangtze Valley between 1850 and 1864, the millions who died in the famines that followed, the millions who died in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that have no equivalent memorialization in Western culture. We call them statistics, but they were not statistics. They were people. They had names and families and futures that the war ended. They were as real as the soldiers on the Western Front whose names are carved on monuments in every town in Britain and France. The question is not whether they existed. The question is whether we are willing to include them in our idea of what history is. Hong Xiuquan failed his exam 4 times. He wanted, more than anything, to be recognized. To be told that his intelligence, his effort, his years of study meant something. That he belonged somewhere. That the world had a place for him. The system that should have provided that recognition failed him. And so he found recognition elsewhere. In a vision, in a pamphlet, in the belief that he was not a failed student but the son of God. Millions of equally desperate people recognized something in that belief because they were living the same desperation. The Taiping Rebellion was what happened when a civilization ran out of legitimate paths for its most desperate people. We don't have an obvious lesson for how to prevent that. Societies have always produced desperate people and failed them. What changes is what happens when someone offers those people a story that turns their desperation into a mission. The 30 million people who died in the Taiping Rebellion deserved better than to be forgotten. The least we can do, now that we know, is to remember them.